All right. So this week's topic, as I hinted at last week, is about place. Last week I did say cities, but I think place and geography are a more accurate description because people argue about what is a city and what is not. So just think of it as location, right? The importance of place in our lives. So I think this is like pretty topical, right? Because we've had coronavirus for the past couple of months. There's been this transition to working from home, and this entire relationship between us and the places we usually go on a daily basis has been uprooted, right? There's a lot of discussion now about is this social distancing and telecommuting shift that we're undergoing going to be permanent? Are we going to be suddenly working from home? Are offices like obsolete now? And this is an idea that's been going around for, I don't know, let's say since the 90s, right? Ever since the internet was invented, people have seen this opportunity to divorce people from all the unpleasant things of having to commute and go to a different location every day and, generally having to interact with the physical world, right? It's called the death of distance, and it's been talked about, continuously ever since Internet Explorer was first introduced on Windows. I've always resented this suggestion that the internet and all this new technology that we're inventing is going to divorce us from the importance of place, right? I think, and I really strongly believe, just because I have such a vested interest in, physical places, both in my career and my personal and political views, that, the places we inhabit are not only essential to our lives, right? We all identify with, living in a certain place in our neighborhood, and we care about, the physical environment that we surround ourselves with, but also because I think place is actually becoming more important than ever. And I want to share with you guys, I can't screen share. Can you turn that on?
Yes, I can. One second. There we go.
So yeah, I want to share with you guys this report that I found that kind of discusses the relationship between political affiliation and population density. And I feel like people don't really recognize that the density of the neighborhood in which you live is actually one of the strongest predictors of what your political affiliation is. And over the past 100 years, it's really shifted from not being a factor to being a huge factor. So you can see in this graph, in the early 20th century, there was no relationship between the share of the population that votes for Democrats and the population density of that place. But in 2016, in the Trump versus Clinton election, it was a huge predictor, right? And basically, Clinton won all of the most densely populated places, and Trump won the most rural places, right? And then the places in between, the suburbs and the edges of cities, are the battlegrounds where people are fighting out, red versus blue. And we've seen that narrative kind of emerge where it's the suburbs that are flipping to Democrats, and it's become the new political turf, right? And you can see here, this report talks about how the densest counties are also the most economically productive, which is also a new trend. So the counties that Clinton won generate 64% of America's GDP, but the counties that Trump won, and Trump won many times more counties as Clinton, only generate 36% of the nation's GDP. And then finally, further down, there's this graph that really sums it up, right? Like if you classify the parts of the country into whether they're purely urban, purely rural, something in between, there's a pretty clear relationship between whether they vote Democratic or Republican. And that's just like one example of identity, right? Like your political affiliation is one expression of identity, and there's plenty of expressions of identity, right? From the music you listen to the clothes you wear. But I think it really speaks to this change that's happening in our country where, the neighborhood you grow up in is such a powerful determinant of who you are, right? It's related to how much money that you can be expected to make as an adult. The type of education you get, the political views you hold, your views on race and other, societal issues. So, as I said before, it's more important than ever. And I'm really curious how the places that we've grown up in, if we can kind of identify how that has affected our personal development, right? I can think of a few concrete examples because I think about it a lot. But we all live or have lived in different cities at different times of our lives, and I think in this discussion today we can really hash out some of the ways that's affected our how it shaped the people that we've become. So that's what I'm looking forward to talking to you about. So,
All right.
Yeah. Do you have any starting thoughts?
Well, I just wanted to comment. Earlier today, I was, I guess it turned into more of an argument than a discussion, but this was with my father, just talking about so he watched a documentary yesterday. It was called The Great Divide. I don't know if that's one you might have heard of. It's a comparison of the presidencies of Obama versus Trump, what's similar, what's different, and kind of how the parties kind of in that interplay, right? So ultimately, he watched it and he thought it was very worrisome and disturbing. He had a much higher opinion of this country's political environment prior to watching that documentary. And kind of to me, on the other hand, I was like, oh, I thought it was amusing. It's like, oh, what kind of embarrassing moment was happening there, right? So we talked about kind of why we felt so differently about it. And ultimately, my conclusion was it's because kind of the way he grew up, he developed kind of a national identity, whereas the way I grew up, I didn't, right? And that has a lot to do with the amount of traveling I did growing up, because I never stayed in one place long enough to really feel like, oh, I am a citizen of that country. Like, despite what my passport says, despite what I look like, right? Like, ultimately today, I don't feel like American or Chinese necessarily. That's really kind of what I would say contrasts between me versus my father, because kind of in the way he was describing his thoughts is to me it seemed very citizenship centric, right? So the reason he came to America to begin with is because he felt like, given China's recent history, his rights as a citizen there weren't being well protected, and he was hoping for kind of a more secure life over in America. So that's why he came over. But then kind of over here, he's still very cognizant of this idea of citizenship. Kind of, especially with recent events, he's growing ever more cognizant of his role as a minority in this country. And he's worried about that, right? Whereas for me, it's kind of I've always felt like a minority wherever I went. So I never had expectations of, oh, I should be this is where I belong, right? It's always been oh, in a few years things will change and I might not have anything to do with this place anymore, because lo and behold, I'm on the other side of the world for other reasons, right? So I think to me that's kind of really the aspect of geography that's played a part in I don't have a very strong sense of nationalism or national identity, but I think it's also made me more tolerant of kind of differences in opinion. Every few years I'll be interacting with people who care about very different things in the world and have very different perspectives on the same things.
Yeah, I think that makes an interesting point about what is our responsibility to our the places that we live or where we're from. Just on the topic of citizenship, I guess your dad might feel a sense of maybe not responsibility, I don't know, but yeah, the nationalism that he feels for maybe China or something. It's somewhere that because he's from there. It sounds like he almost owes something to China, that I guess you certainly don't feel with either the United States or America. Is there any place that you feel that sort of connection to? I don't know, one silly thought that comes to mind is rice. Do you feel at all that you owe something to rice, having gone there for 4 years? And I mean, maybe you called it home for 4 years, I don't know, but as far as somewhere that I mean, because I know your background, you moved all over the place when you were younger, and so this sense of place hasn't really been grounded in you. It's kind of been my sense, and so I know we shared an experience at Rice, and I wonder if you have any semblance of, feeling like you're from Rice now, and like, I don't know, do you feel like a citizen of Rice? Something that like I guess the thought that came to mind with the idea of citizenship was like having a sense of responsibility to Rice, almost maybe that you like owe them something. I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
So you mentioned a couple different things together, so I'll try to take them in order. Starting with kind of, I guess the one I remember first was your comment about my father. And I would say it's not so much he feels that being a citizen means that he owes the nation some sort of debt or responsibility. Quite the reverse. I think in his mind, to be a citizen means to be kind of afforded certain privileges within that kind of society at large, right? So, and I kind of just to clarify that, that's why he moved away from China, because he felt that being a citizen of China was not very rewarding. Like, it didn't afford you very much by the way of rights or security at all, especially kind of like he kind of grew up through the Cultural Revolution, and kind of he was in a university when the Tiananmen situation occurred, right? So like he's sensitive to this idea. I don't feel secure living over there, right? So he thought it would be better over here, but then he came over here and he's realized, well, A, I'm not a citizen, and B, I'm a minority, so I feel vulnerable for very different reasons, right? So it's not so much what he can do for his country, more what his country can do for him. And he's rather upset in both cases, I think. I mean, he has his reasons. It's just kind of what my assessment of how he looks at this issue, right? So then I think your second point is kind of like, well, do I feel a sense of citizenship or kind of belonging to any sort of national identity? And I would say definitely no. And I think that has been a very critical shaper of my views and personality, because absent that national identity, I feel like a lot of natural biases fall away, because I have no reason to be biased. I don't favor, there's no like home team for me, right? Like sports teams, like I just look at the play. Like, I still have my biases, but it's not as far, it doesn't come from favoritism, right? And that kind of carries forward into kind of my thoughts on Rice, and kind of, I definitely don't have that sort of, oh, I'm from Rice, like a Rice owl. And the reason for that is a little bit more easy to articulate than kind of the former, which is, I feel that the Rice today is not the Rice that I went to. Not because, anything specific. It's just because I feel like the Rice I went to is not only a place, but also a time and a set of people. The time has changed, the people are different, right? So this university that still retains the name Rice, really, I'm not necessarily familiar with at all, really. I know the campus, but I could know the campus by looking at a map, right? Do I really know the people? A lot of the professors that I knew and studied under, they have left. No, it's just a different place now. So I definitely don't have any sort of like lingering. I'm saying, oh, I'm from Rice, and I really want to do something for it. It's almost like in the way that the admins took away my Rice email. It's kind of like, oh, it was a business transaction. Like you're the past. Like I feel the same way. It would have been better if they hadn't made this gesture. Right, but like they're cutting ties. Well, it's like, what ties?
So I think there are a few interesting topics we're touching on. I want to get to them all, but they're kind of distinct, right? First, there's like nationality and how that impacts your personal development, which is important. But this Rice issue, I feel like, speaks to something really key to identity, right? Like you'll find a lot of alumni who feel the exact opposite way that you do, Kevin. They'll still have very strong opinions about how the campus looks and functions. A lot of alumni are, very harshly opposed to like adding more residential colleges or, changing the area around the football stadium, right? And if you, see a news article in the Rice Thresher about something the university is planning to build or change on campus, they get into very heated arguments, even though they've been graduated for, 30 years or something, right? And I think that really ties back into, people viewing this physical place, the Rice campus, as opposed to, Rice, the institution, the business, as like a marker of their identity, right? They can point to it and say, I was there for 4 years. I developed, myself as an adult there, and the way the campus looks, its size, its feel is like a marker of who I am, right? Because that was the environment that produced me, and I don't want to lose, this kind of artifact of, this institution that created me, right? So I don't know. I think it's really interesting that you kind of have divorced yourself from the school because, yes, it is a different set of people, but I suppose, considering your upbringing, maybe that translates into not being particularly connected to the campus itself. I don't know. But people definitely use Rice as a proxy for their identities, as alumni, as people who are well into their careers and have children and live in completely different places. And I just think that's a really interesting, way that people kind of fight for their identity and fight for a certain vision of themselves, is to like replicate the places and protect the, aesthetic of where they lived before, right? Yeah, but I do want to talk about the minority and nationality issue, because I feel like I can relate to that too on a pretty deep level, because I came to the US, as an immigrant, in a family that looks different than the families I lived around. And I feel like that really impacted the way I view this country and developed as a person. But we can get into that a bit later if you want to talk more about the Rice issue.
Well, I guess maybe this is related to the Rice issue. Because Kevin, another thing that Kevin mentioned was the sports teams. Like how, I don't know, I guess it doesn't sound like Kevin has a sports team that he roots for, and I'm not sure who he roots for in the Olympics. Maybe he likes both China and America, or doesn't care. He's just watching the sports, right? I think in stark contrast, I feel like I am very much about, following a specific team. I grew up in Dallas, and so I'm a big fan of the Dallas Mavericks. And I feel like I didn't really get a sense of being in a place, like I didn't feel like I was like, when I was younger, I knew about Dallas like as a city kind of broadly, but then I think it wasn't until I started following basketball, following the Dallas Mavericks, that I started to realize that I live in Dallas, and this is like what the city is. And that really gave me a sense of place. And then like growing up, I then moved to Rice, and I even in the sentence just now, I feel like some people might say they moved to Houston and went to school there, but no, I feel like I moved to Rice, right? I don't feel like I lived in Houston at all. I feel like I was a student at Rice University. Part of it is that I lived on Rice campus for 4 years. Part of it is that Rice has this kind of like, I don't know, there's this notion that Rice is kind of detached from its greater community, right? They're living in the hedges and all that, and I think that all contributes to it. And so, yeah, I very much feel like a Rice student. And I felt like a Rice student then, and I still feel like a Rice alum now. I guess I'm kind of more like what Justin was describing, maybe more like an alum who draws on Rice as a part of my identity. And the distinction is interesting. Like the word that kind of came to mind, the two words, I guess Kevin's time spent at Rice, or like Kevin's time that he spends at any place, there's a sense of it being like ephemeral or transient, right? Like it starts and it ends, and like the time that really matters was the time that it was there, right? I feel like just the living on campus, being on campus, and like knowing the being a part of the Will Rice community, like it's difficult for me to detach that from the physical place. And so like when I go back to like Rice, like the last 2 times that I went back and I just like see it, I feel like I always get this like rush of memories, right? Like I see these road names, these street signs, and it's just like, wow, this feels like where I'm from. Like it's just like from a distant memory, like this is a part of me almost. And I felt like that also like when I went back home for the first time, like after like a semester in college, it's just like, like home had just had a different feeling to it. You know, like this is a place that I had grown up in like for 18 years, but then like it's a place that I've been away from for so long now, and like that was the first time that I realized I was like, I don't know, slowly growing away from it, and it was becoming a distant memory. But it was of course always going to be my home. Yeah, I mean, it's the same feeling that I get when I look at like old pictures of old friends, old people, old places. Like it's just I don't know, my like the sense of place. I guess there's a feeling of nostalgia, um, but yeah, so I feel rooted in it almost. And I don't know. I guess I wanted to draw in contrast to maybe Kevin's more ephemeral like attitudes towards places. Right, he comes and goes. Yeah, those are my thoughts on all that.
Just wanted to add to that. I don't want to make it seem like I don't value those experiences. It's just that to me, the experiences have, I guess, either two rather than one dimension or four rather than three dimensions, depending on how you want to look at it, right? It's not just the place, like it's a time, right? So like I'm just imagining if I had gone back to Rice kind of on my own right now, I would look up at New Dorm and just like, yeah, that's the place. It's not the people though. It's just, it's that bit, that the time that I'm very cognizant of. This was the same place, but this is not the same time, not the same. So it just, that the thing that was is just, it's gone, and it's not going to be like that anymore. So it's a little sad sometimes, but it's just kind of how I've had to conceptualize the world, because if I get too attached to things, like this happened at a fairly early age, right? Like just the attachment just wasn't meaningful. Like I didn't stay in a place, like literally it's like, college 4 years, right? That would be our typical rotation. 4 years in like 4 years in America, then 4 years in Singapore, then 4 more years in America, then was it 7 years in China, then it's just in and out. And then 4 years again. Who knows where I'm going to be in for the next 4 years? Right?
So do you think there are some common characteristics of all of those places you just listed that have impacted your identity or shaped your development?
I think it's helped me see past, I guess, discrimination in terms of race, because I truly believe that we are all people, and that encompasses all the good and bad of people. Like the bad people, the way they behave, it doesn't matter where you're from, doesn't matter where you look, like what you look like. They all have such similar characters. It's just as good people do, right? Like, and I say good and bad in a very ambiguous way. Like, I'm not trying to spell out what good and bad looks like. It's just that whatever you think bad looks like, there are going to be people like that wherever you go. There's no part of the world that isn't inhabited by people, I guess, except Antarctica, but even then, right? Like, and the people are all people, and they will all behave very similarly as a kind of an overall like society.
Okay, so I think this is a good segue into the other topic I was talking about. And I feel like both Osman and I can kind of speak to this. We both grew up in the suburbs of Texas, right? And I feel like that particular environment, and it has its own stereotype, which I think is pretty accurate, is very different than the multicultural experience that you've had, Kevin, where you've hopped from place to place. Singapore is a huge port city that's like extremely multiracial. There are workers there from all parts of Asia, right, and the rest of the world, and it's got Anglo influences as well. So I can see how like hopping there and generally being around the Pacific, that gives you a very different view of the world than what I experienced, which was living in Houston for 18 years, after doing a little world hopping myself, but for most of my development years, I was in Texas. So yeah, Osman, I'm kind of curious, like when you grew up in Dallas, how did you feel about, your identity as an Asian person in an Asian family? Was there any friction in your community? Were you surrounded by people that, had similar cultural values to you, or did you find it challenging?
I wouldn't say I found it challenging. I feel like there were many expectations of me, not just from my family, but also from, my friends. I feel like there was an expectation that, oh, he's Asian or he's Chinese, so he should be the smart guy and he should be getting the good grades and stuff like that. And I mean, on the one hand, it is like, racial stereotyping, and I could, speak to how that might have, I don't know, stunted or hurt my development. But on the other hand, I don't know, I feel like it also like pushed me to excel. It pushed me to like try to be the best that I could be because of the expectations that my friends and my family had on me. So yeah, that's kind of like how I felt being Asian growing up, especially like at least kind of specific to me growing up in elementary school. My elementary school was mainly white. It really was predominantly white. I actually looked at some like charts. There's a place online where you can find like the racial breakdown of every single school. It's ridiculous.
Oh, I've seen that one. Yeah.
It's like it's scary how they have all this information. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Yeah, it confirmed my views that, or like what I had experienced was that like I was like maybe one of like 3 or 4 Asian kids in my grade. But then I like went to middle school and high school, and there were more. I started to hang out with more Asians, and then yeah, I don't know. I feel like I then started to hang out with them more. Like, but yeah, and I mean, I don't know, as far as like how that kind of community like contributed to my identity. This isn't something that I'm like super fond of or really like to recollect on too often. But there was this. I mean, I mentioned like there was the expectations that like Asians and maybe Chinese people performed better at school, and so like that almost turned competitive towards like late middle school and high school. Throughout high school, this like I don't know. I mean, it was just an expectation that. First off, the expectation that, an Asian would be like in the top 10% or something. But then just like, I think it evolved into something, I think, even darker, where like, you would, I don't know, like people would go through immense lengths just to like get good grades on things. Like people would cheat. There's big cheating rings and like, I mean, maybe more mundane or less harmful, just like kind of like the classes that people took. I mean, the way people thought about these classes, they were just like different ways to boost your GPA and things like that. So like, yeah, it turned very insular and just like, I think unhealthy for a lot of this, like, I just don't think it was a very healthy environment. Like, and as, somebody in the top 10%, I mean, it was just something that I dealt with every single day. And I think part of it has to do with like the Asianness of it all. I mean, maybe, maybe something like Tiger Mommy about it, like how our parents are really kind of pushing us all to ascend the ranks of GPA and all that. That's certainly not something I look fondly on. But I did mention that I do think like kind of the Asianness in me, or like what my parents have kind of instilled in me, is this drive to be the best that I can be, especially at school, right? Especially like, doing well in school and like, learning from all of your classes, be it like reading, writing, math, like everything. I feel like I gained a deep appreciation for education, being an Asian American. I mean, maybe not the American side, but definitely the Asian side, I think gave me a deep appreciation for it. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if you had that same cutthroat kind of environment. I mean, it sounded like your high school was a little more friendly, right? You guys had like 40 valedictorians.
Well, yeah. One other question I have for you, I guess, is that it sounds like a key factor in all of this was that Plano is like disproportionately Asian compared to the rest of Dallas, right? And not only that, your high school is very highly ranked, right? I think, or it appears on rankings, and it has a reputation for academic excellence that's probably unusual compared to like your typical public school.
Hold on, 40 valedictorians. Is it a 40-way tie or like what?
Yes, it was. So I think I'm assuming Osmond School operated on like a GPA system where there was no cap, and you could just keep accruing GPA points up until like the thousandths of a decimal, right? And letter grades were divided between minus, straight, and plus, right? And each one contributed a different weight. And my school was like an A plus and an A minus were valued the same. And it was a cap on GPAs. So you could get a 6.5, I think was the limit. And once you hit that, it just stopped, right? There was no race to the top. So yeah, we had like 30 something co-valedictorians at the end. And I was one of them. But yeah, I think that was a factor. But I think the reason my school had that system was because it didn't have the, I guess you could call it Asianness quality or this competitive environment. And that was like a product of its demographics, right? Like if you look at the graph of my high school, the racial breakdown was probably pretty different to Plano West's, right? It was, there was a very large Black and Hispanic population, both in my district and in my high school. And then there was like a white population and then a very small Asian population compared to Plano or, Sugar Land, for example. So I think, the school was dealing with, trying to provide a good academic environment for these lower income minority students, who just did not have, the right resources, the right level of resources. And as a result, they weren't really focused on this upper echelon where people seemed to be doing fine for themselves, and there was no reason to encourage like, a hyper-competitive environment. There was no clamoring from a large group of Asian parents to create like that sort of environment, right? Yeah, so I definitely think it was a product of the demographics.
Yeah, I think I sort of touched on this earlier, but like I feel like there was, at least in Plano, like living in a suburb of Dallas, I felt like there was a detachment from the community, like in the sense that a lot of the people who like were super competitive, like school was kind of everything for them, right? Like they, like, I don't know. I mean, it was like the one thing that they could really, at least maybe, I don't know. I don't want to like kind of project onto these people, but I think it was easy to kind of be like to latch onto school as kind of being like the one anchor in your life, and then like the rest of the community. I mean, especially it being a suburb, could like, I don't know, feel empty, right? Where like these suburbs that, I mean, you have a picture of one in your background. I mean, it looks, pretty anonymous, right? There's almost, it can feel like there's a little character in the community. And so I think that could have been another, like, the cutthroatness that I'm talking about could have been a symptom of like the anonymity of suburbs, and how, there could be like a lack of character to them. And so, the one like kind of guiding things for us in our lives was school, and latching onto the idea of school. Because I mean, there was like, I feel like kind of the attitudes toward community service also were a little bereft, I guess. Like they, like, you would do community service for like NHS because that was just like a thing that you did. Yeah. But I felt like the true sense of like doing service for your community wasn't really instilled in us, in a way that I think, I don't know, maybe if you live in inner cities, that it could be a little bit more ingrained in you. Like, what does it mean to like live in a community of people? I mean, outside of your school, right? And I mean, for some other people, like, they find that in church, or they find that in whatever clubs and organizations they're in. But at least the place that I grew up in, I felt like a lot was, Plano Independent School District. And so, yeah, at least for me, like I didn't really get a sense of attachment to Dallas really until I started following the Dallas Mavs, which is something that I'm appreciative of. I don't know. I feel like that's the one thing that kind of makes me feel like I'm from Dallas. Like it's just like, that's the team that I follow. And like, since following them, I really started becoming in tune with like kind of what the greater Dallas community cared about.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought up the suburbs, because obviously I put it in my background for a reason, right? That's something I wanted to talk about. Because I think that's something we all three of us have experience with. Kevin, I assume you're in a suburban house right now, just judging by the background. Am I right?
You're not wrong. You're not wrong.
Yeah, exactly. So we all know about this very typical American environment, right? Where it's not dense, it's not like necessarily a great mixture of different types of people, right? And I think it's interesting that you brought up like the isolation, because I feel like when I was younger, I definitely felt that way about the Houston suburbs, right? I would always complain about how there was nothing to do, and I kind of resented the fact that there was this monoculture around me, right? So I grew up in like, I guess like a white part of town, right? Pretty typical detached houses, and everybody drives everywhere, but definitely predominantly white, right? But not a significant Asian or minority population like you might find in Plano. And I really like resented this like culture, right? Because I could never quite fit into it, right? Because I was an immigrant, right? I'm Asian. I have an Asian mom who looks very different than everybody else. And when we moved to Houston when I was a kid, our neighbors were not very welcoming, of our presence in the neighborhood, right? And there was a clear like difference between me and the kids who lived around me, where like they had this like very strong American culture of like baseball and football, and going to high school football games and having barbecues and shit. And I could just never fit into it, right? My family didn't do those things. We didn't speak that language. And I just found that entire environment and suburbanness of it so like frustrating for like so much of my life. And I feel like it had a really big impact on how I view this country, right? Because in the media and the movies and TV shows, we see the suburbs and we see exactly that, right? We see a lot of white people kind of doing those things. They're playing football and they, have their folksy attitudes, and they drive trucks and SUVs, and it's like an entire thing, right? And if you don't quite fit in that image, especially as a kid, I feel like it's difficult to really see your place at all in this country, because you live in one of those suburban houses and you go to that high school down the street, but you just don't like reflect that identity. So I definitely thought Houston was an isolating place for a long time, until I went to high school and I got the ability to drive, and I could go into the different parts of town and experience the immigrant neighborhoods and like the downtown area, and kind of see, there's a different side to this. And then as I got older, I kind of discovered these like smaller minority populations in Houston, and their restaurant scenes and neighborhoods. Chinatown is a great example. And you realize, okay, maybe the suburbs aren't a universally bad thing, but I definitely think in some parts of cities it's really difficult to assimilate as like an immigrant, even if you can pass as white like I do. There's just a cultural barrier there, and I've really come to identify that with the geography and the place, right? Like there are white neighborhoods and white schools, and they're inhabited by a specific type of person, right? And that's a big part of this country, and it's something, it's just an interesting cultural experience, I guess. But yeah, that was my experience in the suburbs.
So what you described about school is like, as you described it, I just remembered that sounded a lot like how elementary school felt for me.
Yeah.
Like, so funny story. Well, I think it's funny. One of the things that got talked about a lot was baseball at my elementary school. And I didn't play baseball. I played kickball, and we tried playing baseball during recess, but like it wasn't like a regular activity. I was like, oh, this sounds interesting. I want to be part of this. So I went home. Said, Mom, I want to sign up for the baseball team. He's like, great, go figure out how. And I'm like, wait, what? So I was just bewildered. And when I went to school and I asked, I was like, hey guys, baseball sounds cool. How do I sign up for that? Say, oh, actually, I don't know. I just asked my mom. And I'm like, oh, well, okay, well, that worked out great. But I did play football, right? And it's kind of like, I didn't feel out of place ever, even though in some ways kind of relative to you, Justin, like I would have a harder time passing as white, right? But I didn't ever feel like that dissuaded me at all. Like I didn't look at a community and say, oh, they're all that, which I'm not. Right? I was just like, these are just all a bunch of kids just playing. If we're playing baseball today, like I want to be part of that. If we're playing football today, I want to be part of that. So that was kind of how my elementary school experience went in. So I, I may be making this up now, but I seem to recall that one thing that my parents kept asking is like, who do you play with at school? And I never really understood the question. I was like, what do you mean, who do I play with? I play with Michael, I play with Reiner. Like, it's like, okay, but who are these kids? I'm like, well, how am I supposed to describe these people to you? You need to meet them, right? But like, it's only now kind of looking back, I feel like, well, clearly they're asking about kind of their ethnic background, like, and like where they're from, sort of. But it didn't, like, I didn't think about it things that way. I very much focus on like you as a person, like, how do I know you? Not like, how do I know the kind of this social ethnic group to which you seem to belong, right? So yeah, I guess that kind of plays into that overall theme of like me moving around a lot. Like it's just always different people. So maybe I just was slow. I never picked up the patterns. Like, oh, these people kind of like to do these kinds of things. Like, no, it's just this is the guy. I know this guy.
But was there like a pattern to where you went to elementary school? Was it like a mostly white area? Like what was the racial
Well,
breakdown?
so see, that's the thing. I don't have a clear impression. I don't have a strong impression one way or another because half of elementary school I did in Singapore, right?
Oh yeah, yeah.
And there, let's see, I don't even remember. Like there was, so in my vocabulary, when I say international, I usually actually mean Caucasian. Like that's the initial response I get because and then I would say everyone else is some form of Asian, right? International to me meant European or maybe American, like North American, right? Um, that's kind of my default vocabulary. Just kind of that's how the people around me looked, right? Um, that was in Singapore, but then over here, like I could tell kids were different, like in the sense that if you had to group people together very quickly by appearance, like you could make the skin color aspect kind of like a demarcating factor. But again, it's kind of like, no, they were just all individuals to me. I didn't ever try to group them by race. Like
What
just
city was this in?
which city?
Yeah.
Oh, so I went to two different elementary schools over here in California. I think they were both in Danville, but like different sides of it.
Okay.
I don't know. So the first one I went to was Poorer and Newer, or no, Poorer and Newer. Yes, I think so. And then we moved. Then I went to a different school afterwards. After like a year, it's just yeah. So again, like the people changed all of a sudden. It wasn't the same people, right? Like I didn't. Again, it wasn't like, oh, these are all the one group. They're just like, no, they're just different people.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I definitely view it differently, and I'm not sure if that's just a difference in our personalities or a function of the difference between these cities. But there was a very clear divide. I perceived a very clear divide throughout K through 12 between different classes of people, right? And it was like a geography within the schools that reinforced it. There was this like perception of like apartment people, right? Because at my elementary school, there was an apartment complex next door, which was, generally lower income than the single family housing around it. And the people who lived at the apartment complex were like overwhelmingly Hispanic, while the people who lived in the housing next door were white. And I remember the kids used to say, oh, those are apartment people as opposed to like neighborhood people, right? And when I was in high school, and this is really racist, so I apologize, but like the cafeteria was literally split up between the racial groups. And people like said it like out loud, right? There was like one part of the cafeteria that was called the White House, where like all the white people sat, and it wasn't just white people, it was like a, kind of like preppy sort of like, I don't know, Protestant white people, I suppose. And then like there was the courtyard where like black people sat, and people were very like explicit about those separations, right? That segregation. I don't know. I thought it was a pretty prominent theme where I went to school.
So I wanted to add to that, and it's not that, especially by the time I got to high school, this was in Beijing though. I was aware that people seem to like to group together based on appearances and kind of the kind of demographic breakdown in my high school. I'm just saying offhand, I would say is 1/4 Chinese, 1/4 Korean, and then again using my vocabulary, 50% international, which basically means neither of those two, but kind of not necessarily all from the same place either, right? But kind of that was during classes. You kind of felt a little bit that way, and maybe during leisure time. But I think the biggest thing for me was that sports was like the situation where all that went away. Like, it's just because ultimately my class sizes were very small in middle school, high school. Like each year was like 100 people, right? So when you're playing sports, we don't have a great talent pool. We don't have that many people. So like you are forced to interact across those kind of, groups that I kind of just described, right? So, and in those team situations, like when you're playing with them, like at least for me, I just didn't have the bandwidth to then say, oh, I'm not usually friends with this person, right? Like, so I'm not going to pass the ball to him. It's like, no, I want to get the ball in the hoop. Like, coach wants me to pass. This is the play. Like, do the fucking play. Like, there's no like all this, thinking in the back, right? The only time it kind of showed up again was like, again, recognizing that the group of friends that I normally hang out with, none of them wanted to break this barrier. They didn't really want to get into sports. And believe it or not, I was a relatively more sporty guy within my social circle. So like at lunchtime, the rest of the team would often just go upstairs and like, we'll go to the gym and like play basketball and stuff, right? I tried a couple times. It's not that they wanted to exclude me. It's just I didn't find it as fun. Like, they would keep track of, like, in high school, the first time I heard of Kevin Durant was because my basketball coach asked this other kid, like, who's your favorite guy in the NBA? Kevin Durant. I'm like, okay, right. Like, so like they just had this vocab, this kinds of interests that, going beyond the team play by itself that I just couldn't relate to, right? But kind of during practice, during games, like that was never a thing for me. It's just kind of like sports was like a place where I could just forget about all those things. Not that it was always on my mind anyways, but like I just feel like that's a great thing about sports looking in retrospect is time and again throughout my K through 12 education. It's in these sorts of settings that by being involved in those, like I've been able to kind of remove myself from any kind of development of those sorts of biases.
Okay.
Did you find that you had anything like that, Justin?
Like an activity that
Maybe,
broke down
yeah, because I guess,
barriers.
because I mean, you did mention the distinction between your upbringing and Kevin's upbringing. I mean, you had your cafeteria that was demarcated between the White House and the courtyard, right? And I mean, Kevin said that there was a semblance of that in his classes and leisure time, but then in sports, that all, at least for him, kind of went out the window, right? So I don't know. Did you find that there were like, and I feel like this is like a useful question to ask because I mean, given like the kind of the divisive news that we hear, like in recent times, like I was just wondering, like, what are the things that we can do that can maybe bring people together? So
Yeah,
like perhaps sports is something, right? I mean, sports is something that gives you a sense of place, at least for me, or for Kevin, it's like this, teamwork aspect of the game. And so I'm just wondering, like, maybe what parts of your community did you see that really brought people together?
I would say for me personally, I think debate was a good mixer. It's a variety of, different people at debate tournaments and kind of cut across lines, but there was still like a class divide, I think. And, to some extent, there were some minority groups who aren't represented in debate, like, Black kids don't really do debate. So I feel like that was kind of a factor. I didn't play sports, so maybe that, was a barrier for me. things, like not being an athletic type. I never really got to participate in those environments. So maybe I didn't see that side of it. I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think I can see how, you mentioned the Mavs, right? And
Maybe,
Kevin's experience in school. Like those can be things that bring that community together. Like, in a meaningful
one
way.
thought for me was like, I feel like the separations that I saw in high school with regards to Kevin mentioned socioeconomic backgrounds. I feel like it definitely got exacerbated in high school after like you had this division between AP classes and honors classes and all this stuff, right? Like, the Asian guys, it's just like kind of an expectation that like, yeah, you would see different kinds of people in different classes, right? And so, but I feel like back in middle school when there wasn't, different kinds of classes, you'd kind of be in classes with anybody, right? Like, like that, I thought that was like, I don't know. I feel like the sense of community then in middle school was a bit stronger. Like they divided us up into like different hallways, like, so that was like be kind of random, like which hallway you were in. Like there was like at the hallways, there was like the sea otters, the sharks or whatever. I mean, they were just like random stuff, right? But like it was completely random, like which hallway you were in. And so like there was always, I remember there was like like in gym or something, they would like kind of separate you into the different hallways and you'd like, play whatever sports against each other. And so, but yeah, I mean, there were no divisions, I guess, in like kind of like schooling ability, right, that we saw in high school, right, where like, I took all the AP classes, and so I was just around other AP students, and then like then I felt like the divisions really became clear.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought like at least like taking classes together, I think it's really one thing that like at the time I felt like was really building a community, right? Like, oh, this was six period English, right? Like those are like at the end of the year, it kind of felt like, wow, we spent this year together and like we read this book together, and it just like it felt like that it kind of like unified us, being in the 6th period English class. And I mean, I always found like I feel like I get that sense of community even now when I take a class. I mean, I feel like I struggle through homework with people together and stuff like that. But I want to say it was like, middle school and before where, it really was colorless in my opinion, right? Or it was colorful, right? It was like, there's certainly no, like, it didn't feel like there were any racial divisions, and those certainly didn't become like salient in my everyday experience until high school. Cause I mean, we had like things similar to like, I guess what you experienced, Justin, but certainly nothing as stark as the White House. That's certainly kind of shocking.
Yeah. So maybe we should broaden our discussion a bit and move outside of school. Okay. I know we're using school as a very useful, like, it took up a large portion of our lives, but a very useful lens for looking at this. But, the school is reflective of the neighborhood, right? And I feel like that's something we're missing out on a bit is, these divisions, these divides are represented in the broader regions that we live in. I don't know, like when you guys were growing up, did your parents ever talk about like bad parts of town or, areas that you shouldn't go, or even today, in the places that you live now, are there perceptions about like neighborhoods that are worse than others, and do those kind of line up with a certain, demographic?
In my mother's opinion, any part of town that isn't inside the house is a bad part of town. So, that was crazy.
Well,
And
I feel like that's an important like opinion too, right? Because I think a lot of people who live in urban areas are uncomfortable with just the mere presence of people around them, right? I think a lot of people only live in cities because that's where the jobs are and that's where they can make money, get an education. But otherwise, if given the choice, they'd probably wall themselves off in some ranch out in the middle of nowhere, right? So, that's also like a significant factor in people's opinions about places. But I'm curious, Osman,
Yeah.
what your parents say.
So, you wanted to kind of like broaden this from the discussion of schooling, and at least I feel like my answer to your question is that I want to go back to schooling. Like, I feel like we've had a conversation in the past where you mentioned like a phrase to me that's kind of stuck with me about how like education is really like the single greatest thing that can enable social mobility. You said something to that effect, and I
Sure.
like it was a conversation that we had about like, you know, I was like affirmative action in sports is kind of how we brought it up.
Okay.
But like, so there was a conversation that I had with my roommate recently. Like, we've made a promise to each other, because if either of us ever get, you know, filthy rich, like fuck you money kind of rich, then we're gonna go in together on building and starting a school in a poor neighborhood. Because like, you know, I mean, he's done like a lot of research in like engineering education and like how education gets taught at like higher levels. And so like a big question that they kind of have to deal with a lot is affirmative action and like the efficacy of affirmative action. And at least the conclusion that he seems to have come to is that like affirmative action leaves a lot to be desired because it starts too late, right? It's about, you know, putting these like, you know, students who come from worse high schools and putting them in like elite institutions, and then like they, you know, do perform worse, right? And like there's like what's to be done about that? Like there's, you know, is it affirmative action's fault, or like what can we really do to solve the problem? And it seems like at least the consensus between him and the community is that like it's about solving K through 12 education. And I mean, that was just like, that kind of stirred up the thought that you had mentioned to me, that, you know, really education is the greatest, you know, enabler of social mobility. I really believe it. And so like, you know, we have this promise to each other that if we ever, you know, become filthy rich, we'll go in on building a school in a poor neighborhood, you know, with good teachers, right? Truly teachers that want to be there and want to teach them. Because I think it's, and I mean, like, you know, I like, in my eyes, like at least growing up in the suburbs, you know, the school kind of made the community, like at least for like growing up, like that was again, like the one thing that I could latch onto. It really was kind of a big part of like my interaction with the outside world, my interaction with the world outside of my home, right? You know, the good part of town inside my home. You know, my mom definitely had a very similar experience with that. And so, yeah, I guess like, you know, you say that I guess, yeah, I don't know if you can really detach the school, the education from the community.
Well, I don't mean to detach it.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I think, huh?
I was just making a quick observation. So to your point, Justin, about bringing this discussion to the general community rather than the school itself, I sense that in this respect, well, let me start with myself. I don't know that I would have too much to add, just because school has been such a dominating aspect of kind of my growing up. Like I just don't know that much about the communities, I mean, that I've lived in technically. I mean, it has to do with also the fact that I move around a lot, right? But then Osman's point further kind of just like, you know, you can't detach the community from the school. And I just feel like that might just be indicative of our experiences, that it was so totally dominated by the school, right? Whereas you might have a different experience. I want to kind of like maybe dissect that a little bit. Like, why is the broader community something that kind of plays a significant role in your mind, maybe more so than mine or Osmond's?
Well, first of all, I don't mean to detach the school from the community, right? I think like education is a very important part of every community, right? Schools kind of are the core institution in every neighborhood. But I think, you know, the schools also kind of ride or die based on the success of the neighborhood, right? Like Plano West is in Plano West, a very wealthy, highly educated area, you know, a very significant concentration of like white collar professionals, right? I don't think you can like separate the fact that Plano West is an extremely successful high school from the neighborhood in which it exists, right? And it would not be the same if it were transported to South Dallas or something, where people are not wealthy and, you know, do not work in white collar professions. And that's why I wanted to broaden the conversation, because, you know, to your idea, Osman, that you and your roommate have, this has been tried, right? Like, charter schools and magnet schools and private schools and philanthropists. Mark Zuckerberg is a famous example. Back in, I think it was like 2013 or something, he tried to like put 100 or, some nine-digit figure amount of money into the schools in Newark, right? Where Cory Booker was mayor. And they had this big, ceremony where, Zuckerberg and Cory Booker shook hands, and they were like, yes, Mark Zuckerberg is going to come in here and he's going to build these great schools with these very highly paid, respected teachers, and he's going to single-handedly help us turn around Newark's, terrible public school system. And then, years later, the money has been invested and the schools have not succeeded, right?
So are these new schools?
I think it was like an investment into the existing schools. I'm not exactly sure. It might have been a new charter school
it's definitely a very American way of solving the problem.
Yeah, right. A big philanthropist comes in with his money and is like, yeah, the problem here is that the community doesn't have the money, which is an accurate, diagnosis, right? Is that poor communities do not have money. But then the solution is like, okay, we'll put a lot of money into it because we're rich, and then it'll be better. But the problem is the school is ingrained within the neighborhood, right? And if the neighborhood is unstable, if it's, chaotic, like many parts of many cities are. I mean, I live in St. Louis, which is the murder capital of the United States, right? Plenty of discussion about that. Then you kind of can't expect to make these investments and see it succeed, right? And, this kind of, you can go from this observation into many different directions, right? Like, but I think the key factor here is that we've kind of segregated our cities and our places into like pockets of opportunity and despair, right? And the image in the background is a big vehicle for that, right? Suburbanization, where over the past half century, wealthy Americans who are typically white have kind of fled, aging cities for the suburbs where they can build places like Plano, their kind of own insular, very more homogenous communities, where they can kind of like hone in their wealth, literally gate off the streets and create like this utopian little society where they can have, a very well-funded high school and all of the families are together and there's no crime, and the wealth becomes concentrated there, right? All of that opportunity becomes fixed in one place. And in order to be able to enter that club, you have to be able to make enough money to buy a home in Plano and be zones to Plano West, right? And the reverse happens in Black communities or, these lower income areas where people are leaving, once anybody gets the opportunity to, they move to a place with, better resources and, the tax base crumbles, the schools get worse, the children who go to those schools are in more unstable situations. Their parents, might not be together. One of their parents might be in jail or, murdered or something. And the disparity widens, right? So you could come in and say, yes, I'm going to upgrade the school and we're going to pay teachers $80K a year and they're all going to have advanced degrees and we'll build the nicest lab, right? For all of these students. But if their home lives are chaotic and messy and, they don't have food on the table when they get home from school, then it really doesn't make the difference that people expect it to, right? And I feel like that's kind of, this is a good synthesis of everything that I'm trying to talk about today. It's like this idea that like over the past decade or the past few decades, I demonstrated in the introduction, we're seeing this like polarization of place, right? Where some places are wealthier than others and some places are more democratic than others. And there's a very clear correlation between income and race and political affiliation that runs between our neighborhoods. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, we're nearing the end of our time here. I guess I just want to get in that, oh man, what do I want to say? So I guess first off, I totally agree that without a stable community, change is slow, especially in terms of education. You can't just plop a school down and expect that it'll really make a difference. Or I don't know, that what difference can we expect, or what should we be expecting when it is, if we do try to build a school in a poor community. But I guess I don't know, maybe I would hope that maybe we could think of these schools maybe as more like accelerators. Like a good school kind of accelerates a community to change, right? Like, you know, it's certainly not going to make a difference maybe in 10, 20 years, or like in its first generation, but like I think schools is like maybe an anchor in the community. Like if, you know, I mean, on the one, but then like the second thing I want to say is that like it's you know, there is, I think, a problem in this country where people think that if you just throw money at the problem, then like it'll fix it, right? And so like I'm like the idea that like I had with my roommate wasn't just that like, oh, if we have a lot of money, then we can like you know, throw money at the schools, right? It's more like what if you, can you imagine like a Stuyvesant or like Exeter level school like in a poor community where like that was the school that everybody went to, like an actually excellent school, right? Where like, you know, that you could like, I don't know, whatever, feed into like whatever really good colleges or whatever. But yeah, like I don't know, are these the kind of schools that are being built, or like when philanthropists throw money at K through 12 education, is it just like, are they just making investments, right? And like kind of generically they're throwing money at things, right? Like, but I'm envisioning like, yeah, like a school that, I don't know, begins to dominate the community, right? Because I feel like that's like kind of the experience that I got, like this, you know, where school was an anchor in my life, and I think was my ultimate path to success. And so like, if we can give these neighborhoods that sort of community, then I think, you know, it would accelerate it to, I don't know, better future. That's just, you know, a naive hope I had.
Well, I mean, I think it's an admirable hope, but I also think the real challenge is that, you know, kids spend 16 hours of their day somewhere that's not school, right? Unless it's like a boarding school.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens in those 16 hours is pretty critical to being successful in the other 8 hours. You know, like a kid leaves this Exeter level school and has to like walk on broken sidewalks and almost gets run over. And then there's, you know, an oil refinery next door that's pumping pollutants into their lungs. They get home and, you know, their house is robbed that night. Right? There's a lot going on that prevents their success at doing their homework so they can, you know, go to a elite university.
I think that's a very good point, and I think that explains kind of why you kind of went to the broader community, because like, you know, the cliche saying that it takes a village to raise a child is like, you know, this is an excellent example where I think the education, and as you know, the experience you described as Mark Zuckerberg kind of demonstrates, it just enhancing the experience you have in that 8 hours at school, while helpful perhaps kind of in the abstract, if it's not kind of met with a corresponding change in other 16 hours, right, you lose out on a lot of the effects, right? And I guess to me, like, I think this is something, I guess I'm gonna, so I just want to go to this idea that at least in China, the way that you view teachers is traditionally the same way you would view a parent. So if you literally translate like, you know, like a master apprentice, right? The master, 师傅. It's actually you can translate it into like trade father. So like your teacher is kind of like your parents in a different, and in fact it's kind of like, I feel like the best education comes from kind of like a kind of a resonance that occurs between what your family values are and kind of how they view education and, you know, knowledge, and kind of having that resonance occur with what you experience at school, so you get that positive reinforcement going back and forth, as opposed to, say, kind of in the example you just described, you have this excellent school, but then you kind of go home and everything you learned about at class is just, it's a completely different world. You're worried about getting robbed and everything, right? So if you lose that sort of reinforcement throughout all aspects of your life, then a lot of the messages you get are weakened, and you just don't get as strong as an effect.
Yeah. Which is like, I don't know if you have a thought on that, Osman.
So I guess like if we are to improve these communities, if we are to like, because I mean, I feel like the dichotomy you drew, and or like, I don't know, the separation of place that you like, that picture you kind of painted in the beginning, like I feel like kind of what that calls me to do, at least like with regard to like how I think about it, like there are these poor Black communities, right? Historically poor Black communities that, arose from segregation, Jim Crow laws, all that stuff, right? Like racial covenants. I mean, the fact that these people had to live here and they're gonna get poorer resources, like, the fact that like generations of those kinds of people had to live there, right? And were forced to live there. I mean, calls me to think about like, what can I do to like fix that? I mean, what can we as a society do to fix that? Like, how can we atone for these past wrongs? And at least for me, a specific thing that we can do to help these communities is building schools, good schools, right? Like, or I don't know, what do you think? Should we build sidewalks? I mean, apparently walking on a bad sidewalk could,
Well, I always support building sidewalks, but I think I'll give you the radical answer that a lot of people are now like advocating for, right? Is that we need to, instead of moving better resources into poor areas, we need to move the poor people into better resourced areas. The radical solution would be, let's take a lot of poor Black people and move them to Plano.
Let's
right?
settle on the 6s and the 8s.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Like, and I think a lot of people are starting to realize, there's the stigma and the crime problem and all sorts of layers of issues with these poor communities, right? But research has demonstrated that one surefire way to provide better opportunity to people is simply to move them to safer, wealthier neighborhoods, right? But it's incredibly controversial, right? Because at least a lot of the wealthy people in those wealthy neighborhoods kind of think that the reason their neighborhood is wealthy is because it doesn't have these poor people.
So what is the study? So they displaced these people and then they turned out better? Is that what
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't point you to a single study right now, but at least the discourse I've seen in urban planning circles and the push now in public housing construction in particular is that we should be building, housing for lower income people in wealthy neighborhoods, because that way they can access not just the schools of a wealthy neighborhood, but the, resonating environment, to use some of Kevin's herbology, right? It's like the safe streets and the lower crime rates and, the entire ecosystem that makes places like Plano or what other Tony suburbs,
I guess like
good places to live.
I don't think these poor neighborhoods are like inherently 6s or like 2s and 12s on the Catan board, right? Like it's not like it's more about how these communities and places have been treated, I think, historically. Like, just the general lack of resources that's been given to them, right? I mean, I don't know, like at least in Los Angeles, right? Like there's this huge swath of South LA that is, if you look on like kind of like the racial divides of LA, like it's just all Black, right? Like it's Black and there's like a Black community, there's a Hispanic community. And it's very clear, like, I don't know. I mean, like I look at these things and I feel like I'm living in the 1960s and I can't believe that like the world is still this segregated, right? And it's something that's really struck me. Like when I first saw this, there's this like racial dot map of the United States where it shows like there's like a dot for like 5 people and it's a certain color based off like the race. And so it's so clear that like, if like this area, this community was, segregated to be Black and, was treated in that way. Perfect. Right. Like this is just like historically, like these were the divisions that were drawn. Right. And segregation ended in the 1960s. And I mean, you sort of getting like a smearing of the color, right. As like along the borders and stuff like that. But like, it's like so obvious that these communities are going to be poor and worse off because like just kind of historically that's how they've been treated. And so like just like one thing that's been on my mind recently is like, how can we atone? How can we like, what are the reparations that we could do to fix this, right? To like fix these past wrongs that like have happened in our country. And I think building schools, at least was the first thought that came to mind for me. But moving people, like, I mean, my thought with that is that like historically, like forced movements of people is bad, right? Like forcing people like.
Well, I didn't use the word force.
Yeah, right. Of course. But you're saying building low-income housing in wealthier communities was a suggestion that would spur like more people to move there.
Yeah, I just think, this entire issue requires sacrifice, right? I think white and wealthy Americans view building fancy schools in poor neighborhoods or, that sort of solution as favorable because it doesn't require them to make any sort of uncomfortable sacrifice of their own, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this isn't like an attack on you or your ideas. I just think, this country has put an incredible amount of effort into separating wealthy people from poor people, right, over the past century. We reconstructed our cities to look like Los Angeles here or, any of the other places in the US. And to kind of keep putting poor people in these dilapidated areas where, the infrastructure has been bad, right? And it would take an immense amount of money and time to rebuild things so that the quality of a wealthy place, it's the preferred solution. It's long been the default solution in our politics because white people do not want minorities in their neighborhoods. They don't want poor people in their neighborhoods, right? But I think if we're going to solve this problem, we have to reverse the segregation. We have to mix people, and bring poor people to where the opportunity is rather than try and bring the opportunity to the poor people. Because the second way, it is possible, right? I'm sure if, given an unlimited sum of money and an unlimited amount of time, we could reconstruct South Los Angeles to be in the image we want it to be. But the easier solution is to simply build housing for the poor people in the rich areas. And, I think the zoning is currently used, especially in California, as a really powerful tool for the wealthy class to avoid having that conversation and doing those hard things, right? Like a lot of these blue areas, like along the coast here around Santa Monica or up in the hills, are zoned so that, you can only build single family housing. The supply of housing is limited. Therefore, the cost of housing is really high, and you have to be ultra wealthy to just buy a plot of land in one of these places, right? And that's a way of, the wealthy class kind of keeping, gatekeeping, right? They're keeping the undesirable people out, and they're hoarding those resources for themselves. So to me, I think the radical but incredibly unpopular solution is that we need to, break down those walls, let the poor people in, build the housing there, and simply put people where the resources are, But the issue now is that the wealthy are kind of allowed to build their little enclaves like Beverly Hills where they can just, keep it all for themselves, and they can have the wealthy school and they don't have to share that with anyone, because it's zones to them. They own it.
Yeah. At least in LA, these probably are the 6s and the 8s. I mean, it's
definitely.
Like up in the hills. You always want to be on top of a hill, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a convincing argument. Maybe place is more important than the school.
Well, I just think the school is a function of the place. It's a really important function, right? And a good school can have benefits on the place, but they're hard to, I think the qualities of the neighborhood that a school is in is really the dominating factor. And that's why I think, our conversation today was really interesting, because I got to hear about what you guys, where you guys grew up and how that sort of distinction, or that characteristic of our cities has played into our lives on like a smaller scale.
Yeah, the TLDR for me is that I'm just a nerd, and I like schools.
Well, I mean, schools are good. Schools are good. They're important. Yeah. Are we ending it here, or
I think that's a good spot to end it.
You guys want to say?
Okay. Well, until next week.